So today, I want to do kind of a one-off study of something that, man, I went down a rabbit trail the other day. And I felt like that God was leading me toward something that He really, really wants me to understand. And I really want to just record this, honestly, so that I can even look back at it. And I don't think I have it all figured out yet. I don't think that I fully understand what it is that I'm supposed to take from this. I felt like I've already seen some of this before, but it's really, really drilling this home for me lately. So just to give a little bit of background. So Sunday, this past Sunday, we were, in our sermon, we were in Hebrews chapter 2, and I had my Bible out, and I felt God just kind of leading me, pulling me to keep reading in Hebrews. It's been the Christmas season. We've had a lot going on, and I have been very exhausted and very tired. And in Hebrews 3 and 4, it talks about rest, right? Resting in God. And I've studied in this before, and I've experienced that rest before, but for whatever reason, during this last month or so, it's been extremely difficult to feel rested. And I read through these verses that we're going to go through multiple times, and as I studied them afterwards in the next couple of days, it really, really went far down into an area that I hadn't really made connections before. So I'd like to walk through some of that today, and it's going to require a little bit of jumping around, so stick with me on this. We're going to be in the Old Testament, New Testament, in a couple of books that I have, so we're going to hop all over. So Hebrews chapter 4, right, is where I ended up, where Paul was speaking about entering God's rest, and there's actually some really confusing stuff in what Paul is saying in his instruction on rest. It seems to circle on a few things, right? So first, this equating of rest to the promised land in the Old Testament. It also circles around unbelief, and the third thing I kept finding was it referring to the day of rest, right, the Sabbath, and that changing to today, right, an open, ongoing invitation, rather than the seventh day being observed officially in the Old Testament law. And so I kind of just did a scan of what was in the different chapters of Hebrews just to leading up to that, to make sure that I had the context right. So in chapter 1, we had God speaking to his children, not through prophets, but through his Son now, who sat down after his work next to the Father in a position higher than angels, who are ministering spirits to those who will inherit salvation. And there's more in chapter 1, but that's kind of the highlights, right? Chapter 2 has a warning not to drift away. It talks about the order of things, of men and of angels, and Jesus' place in that order. It talks about the connection we have as siblings of Jesus, and the need for Jesus to be human, to be able to properly atone for our sins and relate to and help the children of God. And then we get to chapter 3. It talks about Jesus in relation to Moses as our high priest, and a call to fix our eyes on him. And this is where it starts to get a little bit, it starts to link into rest, right? So there's a warning against unbelief in verse 3:12. So it says, "See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God." So I started digging a little bit, and I went to the Blue Letter Bible to see, what was written in here for sinful, and it is written as an evil heart sometimes, but the meanings of evil here were interesting. So in the Blue Letter Bible, the word poneros, it's G4190. The definitions of this were full of labors, annoyances, hardships, right? So oppressed and harassed by laborers, bringing toil, annoyances, perils, a time full of peril to Christian faith and steadfastness, and causing pain and trouble. And then, of course, the other definition of evil, as we usually think of it, as bad, with a bad nature or condition, like in the physical sense, it could be diseased or blind, and in an ethical sense, evil, wicked, or bad. Right? So that last one is what we usually think when we think of evil. But this warning in Hebrews 3:12 talks about a sinful, unbelieving heart, sinful being evil, which kind of refers to, if we kind of follow this thread, it refers to a time full of peril to Christian faith and steadfastness. So that's interesting already, right? But if we go even further, the word unbelieving actually aligns with something we heard recently that refers to the opposite of faith is not doubt, right? It is unfaithfulness. It is unfaithfulness. And that unfaithfulness means that you are in want of faith, you have a weakness of faith, or even disobedience. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're questioning things or that you're uncertain, but that you are unloyal, unfaithful, as you would be like in a relationship and you have like a wandering eye. That's the opposite of faithfulness is the wandering away, the disloyalty. And so this warning in Hebrews 3:12, I'm going to read it again. See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. All right, so, okay, we're going to go way down the rabbit hole, but remember and keep in your minds for a minute what the Bible says in different places about the hardening of the heart. Okay, keep that in mind for a minute. All right, so if we have those two words, what about the rest? Why is that this turning of the heart associated with rest? Okay, it gets confusing. So it's hard to follow Paul's thoughts, but right after verse 12 comes in verse 13, but encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. And he starts quoting from their Old Testament verses, which seem to make no sense when you're talking about rest. Okay, but follow this trail. He starts quoting like Psalm 95, 7 and 8. So it says, "Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart as you did in the rebellion." The rest of it, verses 6 through 11, says, "Come, let us bow down and worship. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker, for he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, the flock under his care. Today, if only you would hear his voice and not harden your hearts as you did at Meribah, as you did that day at Massa in the wilderness, where your ancestors tested me. They tried me, though they had seen what I did for 40 years. I was angry with that generation. I said, they are a people whose hearts go astray, and they have not known my ways. So I declared an oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest." All right, there's a lot going on here. So we're now seeing a closer relation between rest and a hardening of the heart, right? That turning away, that disbelief, the unfaithful heart, and the lack of rest. Okay, he's working to make this case. And it's really actually interesting that God, that I'm being pointed back to this event at Massa. He used this previously with me. This is referenced in Exodus 17:17, in Numbers 20:1-13, and Deuteronomy 6:16. So this is where they get the water from the rock, right? God has given Moses instructions to speak to the rock, and Moses strikes the rock instead. He's frustrated, and he does not accurately represent God in this moment, and so God becomes angry with him. And this is where Moses, from there, and because of this, God tells him, you will not enter the promised land. You will not enter my place of rest, right, that has been promised to them. So again, we're seeing this connection between resting and obedience now, right, of Moses not being faithful in his obedience to God, and then therefore being removed from accessing the rest that God has promised. All right. So Numbers 20:12 says, but the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you have not believed and trusted me to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel, you therefore shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. In the Amplified Version on that verse, there is a reference to Psalm 106, verse 7. It says, our fathers in Egypt did not understand nor appreciate your miracles. They did not remember the abundance of your mercies, nor imprint your loving kindness on their hearts. So now we're talking about more than just Moses' disobedience. It's, God is frustrated with this entire generation that has come from Egypt, right? Because they keep forgetting. And if you read through Exodus, you see this pattern over and over. You get exasperated reading it, because he will do something like part the Red Sea for them to walk through, and then immediately afterwards they forget and they're whining and complaining, and it's like they never saw it happen, right? It's the forgetting of what God has done immediately and demanding more all the time, right? So Psalm 106:12 says, then Israel believed his words, they sang his praise, but they quickly forgot his works. They did not patiently wait for his counsel and purpose to be revealed regarding them. So this is from the Amplified Version. But lusted intensely in the wilderness and tempted God with their insistent desires in the desert. So he gave them their request, but sent a wasting disease among them. Whew. Yeah, read Numbers chapter 11 if you want some rough reading, right? Yikes. So, okay, this trail, if you follow this, it goes all over the place, right? How many chapters have we looked at already? We've been in Hebrews, we've been in Numbers, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Psalms. This is all over the place, right? But this is something that Paul was speaking of in this letter that they would have understood very easily, because they were learned. A lot of them were aware of what was in the Old Testament. And so to them, this rabbit trail, that Paul is referring to is pretty familiar. Maybe I should double check that. I'm pretty sure Hebrews is written to Israelites, but he did most of his stuff was outside of that. So I should double check, but I'm pretty sure that this letter is to people who would have understood these references that he was making. All right, so this is quite the rabbit trail that we're on, but stick with me, okay? So it underscores here what Paul is saying at the end of Hebrews chapter 3. It says, and to whom did God swear that they would never enter his rest, if not to those who disobeyed? So we see that they were not able to enter because of their unbelief. So at that moment, as I was studying through it, I was hearing the words of Jesus at the Last Supper, right? When he breaks the bread and he hands it to them, and he drinks from the wine, and he tells them to drink from the cup, and he tells them, do this in remembrance. And it makes me wonder, is communion more of a way of helping us to remember, to help us recall the things that God has done, so that we don't forget and become like the Israelites who were taken out of Egypt, where they immediately forget the things that God has done, and they become discontented, and their discontent leads them into unbelief or unfaithfulness, which leads them into disobedience. Right? So it's like a domino effect of things, and it begins with forgetting. We forget what God has done, and we move past it, and we want immediately something else. Right? This is our nature, and God became so frustrated with this, with the Israelites, that he, like Numbers chapter 11, like a whole bunch of them were just wiped out at that event. So all of this leads us finally into Hebrews chapter 4, right? So in chapter 4, we have the promise of entering God's rest that still stands and is freely offered. We have the promise that was offered to their ancestors, but they failed to reach the resting place, the promised land, because they did not remain faithful in belief. And that the promise of rest is offered again to those who personally trust and confidently rely on God and receive that inner peace. Okay? So this is where things were really pinging for me during that sermon, right? So Paul starts referencing Genesis in this area, that God rested on the seventh day. And he says his works were completed from the foundation of the world. And in the Amplified Version, in brackets, it says, waiting for all who would believe. Since those first invited into rest failed to enter, God has renewed the invitation to today once more. So there remains a full and complete Sabbath rest for the people of God. For the one who has once entered his rest has also rested from the weariness and pain of his human labors. Right? So just as God rested from his own and has been at rest since then, he's inviting us into that constant and permanent rest through our belief, right? Through our faith. And so this segues into the two-edged sword, right? And it makes a little bit more sense now in this context of judging the heart, right? A hardened heart cannot enter God's rest due to unbelief. And so the more that I study this, the more I really think that forgetting what God has done is our greatest source of danger. It is in forgetting that our hearts begin to harden, right? And we need to do everything that we can to remind ourselves not only of what is written in the Word and what has happened historically, but what God has done in our own lives. What has He done in your life that made you believe, that built your faith, and then stand on it. Don't let it go. Don't let it slip away from you, because as soon as you start to forget, that's when your heart begins to harden, and that rest becomes harder for you to access. And all of this was just kind of running through my mind, and it was funny because when I got done with that, I remembered that it wasn't very long ago, weeks ago, that I was asking God. Let's see if I can find this in my journal. So, yeah. So the beginning of December, it's been about a month. I was asking God, what do I do about, this lingering fear almost that I was carrying because of the testing that He had put me through earlier this year. It was absolutely brutal in this test, and it was literally what I call the dark night of the soul, where you've stepped wholeheartedly with everything that you have and surrendered it to God. And in that moment, and I have found other references of this occurring, that this where this dark night of the soul comes from. In that moment is when you are tested in your faith, right? Is your faith now strong enough to carry you when you cannot sense the presence of God? It is an awful, terrible, heart-wrenching, soul-crushing test. And I believe that this is what the disciples experienced when Jesus died. When he was crucified, they believed into him. They had been given everything that they needed up to that point, and now they only had faith. There was no evidence in front of them anymore that everything that they had been doing and everything they had believed and been following was still accurate. Their testing of faith occurred, and I believe that Christians today, once you reach a certain point, I believe that God will test you in the same way. And that dark night of the soul is similar, right? It's like, don't forget. Don't forget. And so when I had been asking God, because I experienced that, and because there's this lingering fear, it's not funny, it makes me laugh because I really want to cry. There's a lingering fear that test will come again. And it is so terrible in that moment that you don't ever want to experience it again. And so I was praying, I was like, God, what do I do with that fear? I don't want to carry that. And what do you think he told me that day? I wrote it down. One word followed by its multiplication, right? Remember. That was the word that he told me. Remember. And so I was like, well, okay, but what is it that you want me to remember? And then all of these things kind of poured out, right? Remember when you are weak, where your strength comes from. Remember when you see suffering in the world around you, that there is good hidden in the bad. Remember that you are fighting to keep as many as possible from feeling that same separation from God for all time. Remember that all who can be saved will be saved. Remember what it felt like when my flesh was left completely vulnerable and without his help as a shield. This is how everyone who doesn't know him lives. Remember, Jesus suffered the same and more, so much more. Remember that on the other side of this test is great reward and understanding. I would not trade what I learned from that to not have experienced it, but it was so awful, honestly awful, that it left a fear. Remember that pride is the root of all sin. Pray continuously that he will deliver us from this corrupted root in all its forms. And I asked him, what else do you want me to remember? And he said, remember that I love you. And in circling back through all of this stuff in Hebrews and all of this rabbit trail, there was one more thing to remember that needed to be added to this list. Remember what I have done for you. That is the key to keeping your heart from hardening little by little, right? That hardening doesn't happen overnight. It's in all the tiny little things that we allow ourselves to forget about. And there was one thing missing from the list, a critically important thing that he brought me back to in this study. Just like the Israelites that constantly forgot the miracles that God performed, just like, we see it over and over when they came to arrest Jesus, right? He healed a man in front of them and they just were like, not seeing it, forget it. The remembrance is the key, and I believe that is the reason why communion is so important. It is a mechanism that he gave us to help us remember, because it's that important. All right, so there's one other thing that I found recently in this idea of rest. It's in a book from Andrew Murray, and it's, I don't know if I can see this, let's hold it up here. So this is actually a fantastic book. I've not made it all the way through, I'm about halfway, but there is a part of this on page 129 that says, the chapter heading is, "You will find rest for your souls." And there's some pieces in here that I have experienced, but I feel like they're very, very important and tied to this topic that I don't want to forget. So I'm going to put it here. So there's a chapter at the very last line of it. It says, have you ever noticed how in the original invitation of the Savior to come to him in Matthew 11:28 and 29, the promise of rest was repeated twice, with such a variation in the conditions that it might suggest that abiding rest can only be found in abiding nearness. Right? And he talks about where he says, come to me and I will give you rest. Right? So at the moment that you accept and you receive and you come, he will give you rest. He gives you pardon and acceptance, and you're brought into his love, right? And we know that all God bestows needs time to become fully our own. It must be embraced, appropriated, and assimilated into our soul. Without this, not even Christ's giving can make it our own in terms of full experience and enjoyment. And so he talks about the fact here that Jesus repeats that promise in words that speak not so much of the initial rest that he welcomes us with when we're weary and we come to him, but there's a deeper and personally appropriated rest of the soul that we would attain, right? And so it's not like he's not only saying come to me, but also take my yoke upon you, right? So not only I will give you, but you will obtain, you will receive this, right? Abide in me, learn from me. And he has a thing too that I have underlined. It says, entire surrender to Jesus is the secret of perfect rest. Giving up one's whole life to him, to rule and order, taking up his yoke, and allowing ourselves to be led and taught of him, abiding in him, and do only what he wills. These are the conditions of discipleship, without which there can be no thought of maintaining the rest that we got when we first came to Christ. So when we first come at the invitation, we get that immediate rest, that joy, that fulfillment, but it is the full surrender, the full abiding that brings the more permanent and constant rest that the Bible, that Paul is even referring to in Hebrews. So there's a couple other lines in here. It says, it's because so many young believers fail to grasp this truth that their rest so quickly evaporates. With some, it is that they really didn't know. They were never taught that Jesus claims undivided allegiance of the whole heart and life, right? They didn't know that there was a spot over which there was not anything in us that Jesus did not want access to and control over and authority over, right? But there's some Christians who they have some idea of what a holy life ought to lead them to, but their mistake, he says, is a different one. He says they could not believe such a life could be attained. That taking, bearing, and never for a moment laying aside the yoke of Jesus appeared to them to require such a strain of effort and such an enormous amount of goodness that they assumed it was beyond their reach. The very idea of always, all the day, always abiding in Jesus was too high, something they might attain to after a life of holiness and growth, but certainly not what an immature beginner was to start with. They didn't know when Jesus said, my yoke is easy, he spoke the truth. How it is actually the yoke which gives the rest. Because the moment the soul yields itself to obey, the Lord himself gives the strength and joy to do it. Man, when I read those, I couldn't do enough underlining and highlighting and starring, and this is the warning that Paul is giving us, right? You come, you receive the initial rest, but you start to forget. You don't accept. There are certain things that you want to keep to yourself, that you don't surrender, that you don't give him authority over, and those little things begin to harden your heart, and it pushes you farther away from the rest that is offered. This is a fantastic book. If anybody wants to dive deeper into what some of the more mature Christian spiritual areas sound like, Andrew Murray is fantastic to read. But yeah, all of that is where God has been leading me, and it was quite the rabbit trail that I went down the other day. And it's funny because a lot of the things that I've been doing lately have circled around this idea, and they were all pointing at this central position of remembering, and why it's so important. So I don't know how much of this makes sense to anybody but me. Maybe this is just unique to how he's been speaking to me and what he's been showing me, but I really wanted to capture it so that I can come back and look at this, because I don't think that I'm completely done with this. I think there's still more to discover in this area, but there's been a lot happening in this realm. So I hope this is helpful to somebody. If you have any experience in some of these things, if those connections speak to you, and if it means something, I would really love to hear from you and understand what that looks like in your understanding and your experience with God. You know, we are meant to encourage one another, we're meant to help and support one another, and I'm just very grateful for those of you who are watching and who offer feedback and explain what your experiences have been. Right? Thank you for watching. Hope that you have a blessed day, and I will see you on the next one.